We didn't have the air conditioning in those days. There were no nets to keep the pigeons away, and there would be a constant flurry of pigeons entering this courtroom. As it so happened, when he was arguing before Justice Variava, there was a pigeon dropping, which fortunately, unfortunately, fell straight on his gown. Now, there are several communities in the country, as you know, who believe that if there's a pigeon dropping or a dropping of a bird, that's a sign of auspiciousness. So a lawyer would be prone to believe that, well, that's going to result in an order in their favor. But lo and behold, Justice Variava looked at him, and then gave him a half smile. And then he says, looks at Justice Variava and says, "My lords, the peacocks have become very mischievous." But we also had a Chinese delegation in this courtroom, where one of those peacocks, the pigeons, hit the fan and then fell straight on the ground in a pool of blood. Now that I look at all these things from a vegan perspective, I say, what a loss of one more life in nature. As a Chinese delegation, I thought I was the general manager catering, as several of my colleagues called me, because I was in charge of ordering food for all these events. And I'd ordered all of the Indian Chinese food for the delegation, because I thought we will tell the Chinese what Indian Chinese looks like. And promptly, the Chief Justice sent for me and said, "But why do you have to order so many dishes of noodles? And can we not cut down on the expense?" So I then realized, that we had Chief Justices who were very scholarly, Chief Justices who were pretty much practical, others who were visionary. I used this courtroom to escape from clients and solicitors who were trying to chase me. Because one of the secrets which I had developed as a young lawyer was to go into a court where I was no work at all, because nobody would track you down in that court. And I would sit in the last row and read my cases which were likely to come up that day or the next day. And I spent so much of time watching from this courtroom. It used to be the tax bench when I was a young member of the bar, when all these ITRs, the income tax reports, would be spread out into this courtroom. But honestly, looking at so many of you who were so gracious in complimenting me this evening, looking at you and following your careers, I realize how distinguished you have become. Years ago, I would have called you Venki. Venkatesh came and gave me this lovely memento. There's, of course, my very dear colleague in chambers, Biren. Then there's Deepa, Farzana, so many of you who I now see across this courtroom, and forgive me for not mentioning all your names. But I do believe now that you have become so distinguished. Am I justified in calling you by your first names as I did then? But I must share a secret with you. When I joined the Bombay bar, the bar of our High Court, I joined the chambers of Mr. Dhananjaya, a fearless lawyer, an erudite lawyer, a scholarly lawyer. We were a small chamber. He would carry his own satchel to his car, never relied on a peon to carry his briefs. I walked into his chamber and said, "Good morning, sir." And he said, "Look, there are no sirs at the Bombay bar. You better learn to call me Temten." And I've carried that tradition through to this day in the Supreme Court. And I call all my colleagues by their first name. And I think that sets a sense of camaraderie, a basic degree of equality, particularly when you become senior as a judge or senior as a professional. The ability to reach out to people, to make them feel one with you and understand you and not be a distant spectator from you, is the heart of any work in a public institution. Just this morning, when I handed over a potted plant to the Chief Justice designate, my successor, Justice Sanjeev Khanna, I said to myself, can I call him Sanjeev, as I always do in the morning? And I said, well, at least until the 11th of November, I'll do that. And after that, I'll call him Chief Justice. Because there's something about calling each other by your first names which endears you to each other. And I think that has been the great tradition, particularly on the original side. On the appellate side, it was a little different because we, of course, belong to a different area of social life where we pride relationships, we respect relationships, and we expect that sense of respect by calling people with a more honorific name. But that shows the diversity of our court. This diversity which truly brings the melting pot of traditions, cultures, and ideas into the institution of the Bombay High Court. When I joined the profession, honestly, I was overwhelmed at entering into the portals of the Bombay High Court. I'd had a brief tenure of practice in the Supreme Court, but there was nothing like the Bombay High Court. My senior sat on the middle table in the bar library on the second floor, and there were distinguished members of the bar on that table. There was, of course, the redoubtable Avinash Rana, who I'm so grateful for his presence this evening, Iqbal Chagla, and so many other lawyers who were part of that central table. If we just walked into the corridors, we had judges like Justice Painse. Painse, for the simple reason that I mentioned, that if you walked by his courtroom after lunch and he had just assembled, you could be sure that it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. His sense of professionalism, he was always ready with all the briefs that came up before him. The ability to formulate minutes of the order, that taught us how to frame reliefs. Because very often, the truth or the substance of a matter lies in what relief we grant to the client, whether as judges or what relief you seek as a lawyer. Too often a good case can be lost just because of the inability of a lawyer or the judge to formulate the relief which has to be granted. But Justice Painse, he was very brief, sometimes even curt. He couldn't stand up to fools, and I got the wrong end of the stick on a large number of occasions from him. But absolute sheer brilliance, and we were mentored by Justice Painse. Justice P.D. Desai, a distinguished Chief Justice who came here. Calcutta's loss was Mumbai's gain. He was transferred from Calcutta to Mumbai because there was a little bit of a brawl in Calcutta. But Mumbai opened up its arms for this judge who would have a veritable darbar in the morning, trying to resolve cases through mediation at a point of time when nobody knew about mediation. And there would be family cases, labor cases, service cases, motor accidents cases, where he would be trying to resolve cases. As young lawyers, sometimes we joked about it. And we joked about it because we wanted our cases on the daily board to be called out. But now, looking back in reflection, I realized the importance of what the judge did. Because he did believe that his role was not just about writing judgments, but bringing about true justice to the citizen, which he did sometimes by persuasion, a lot of times through the weight of personality which a judge commands, sometimes with a little bit of stick. But it tended to work. We had judges like Justice Lenton, fearless, sat in the tunnel court, as we called it, court number 37 on the first floor. Justice V.P. Tipnis, Justice Viju Tipnis. He had the ability, even if he was holding against you as a lawyer, he would have the ability to formulate what you had argued and lift it to a different level. So the great reward of appearing before Justice Tipnis was not the fact that you had won or lost, because that's subsidiary. Just as a doctor doesn't guarantee the success of the treatment of a patient, how can a lawyer guarantee a result? Because contingency fees anyway are illegal in India. But what he would do is that if you argued a point, he would lift your argument and place it at a level or pedestal which even you had not done. That was also a training to the lawyer of what I could have argued, but which I didn't. I argued perhaps at a much lower plane, but here was a judge who could lift what I argued into a different plane. So it was a training ground for those like me who became judges, but it was also a training ground for us as lawyers to understand how an argument, by a simple reconceptualization, can be lifted from the mundane to the sublime. Justice Sujata Manohar, one of the fine and first of the women judges to occupy judicial office here and then in the Supreme Court, not exactly the first in the Supreme Court, but a distinguished judge, grace personified, but grace combined with a strength of character and ability to stand up to anybody. There was no way anybody could browbeat the judge. Justice A.P. Shah was so fond of encouraging us as young members of the bar. I remember at the end of a long term like this, and I'm not going to keep it very long because I know it's the end of the term and you have a 2-week vacation, I was having a dosa with my dear chamber across the road in Welcome Restaurant when my peon came running to me and said, it was 7 o'clock or 7:15, and he said, please come, I've got your gown. Justice A.P. Shah is still sitting in court on the first floor. So those were the kind of judges who really nurtured us. Justice V.A. Mota, who came in from Nagpur and succeeded so brilliantly in this court. I don't know if I have narrated this story before, but if I have, maybe you'll forgive me for narrating it a second time. I was appearing before Justice Mota and Justice Jhunjhunwala in a case involving a sugar dispute of a sugar factory. We had argued that matter repeatedly, and then on a day like this, just before Diwali, it must have been 1995 or 1996, he called us to the chamber. They were dead against me. The court was completely against me. And he said, Dr. Chandrachud, you know, would you like to take your chance before another bench after Diwali? So we will not take up this matter. We'll release the matter. You can take your chance before someone else, perhaps? And I knew they were against me. And much to the consternation of Mr. Popat from Mullah and Mullah, who was briefing me in that case, I said, my lords, I'm quite conscious of the fact that you are completely against me. But I'm more than satisfied that you have understood every point that you have argued, and I have nothing further to argue in this case. So please, you can reserve judgment, and I know that I'm not likely to succeed, but that's where the balance of justice in your eyes lies, and I accept it. But I don't want to avoid the court and go to another bench today. So they said, but you know, we are really tired. This is a long term, and I think we're not really keen now. We want to leave the court. So I bowed to him and I left the chamber. Next term, we succeeded hands down before another bench. Which really also tells you that there is some astrological element in the outcomes of cases as well. Lawyers, my own senior, Mr. Andhyarujana, ramrod straight, as someone once told me when I joined his chamber, a no-nonsense lawyer. When we used to travel to Goa, and you had all these beautiful resorts which had come up in Goa, he insisted that we'll never spend the client's money staying in a fancy resort. He would always insist on staying at the Mandui, which was near the High Court in those days, because he said you shouldn't spend unnecessary money for the clients, and you're so close to the court. We would sit together till late hours every evening, working out cases. Mr. Sirvai, I had the good fortune of observing Mr. Sirvai in this court in his fading years. The brilliance was still there, the passion, the commitment to the cause of justice was there. I remember arguing the challenge to the validity of the Public Premises Eviction of Unauthorized Occupants Act, when he argued sitting down before a bench of Justice Bharucha and Justice Sri Krishna. Again, I was the last counsel to argue. And I pointed out something which was a new judgment which was dead against us. And Mr. Sirvai then got up and said, my lords, this is in the best tradition of our bar. This young junior has cited a judgment which no one wanted to cite. And I was going to begin with this judgment. And I must compliment this junior. There was once a case where I was appearing before Chief Justice Chittatosh Mukherjee. We were serial number 1 on board. When Mr. Sirvai called our chamber at 10:15 in the morning, when Homi Sirvai called, my senior picked up the phone, and he was explaining to him what he was writing in the latest edition of the Constitutional Law of India on the judgment in Bachchan Singh, the death penalty case. This conversation went on from 10:15 to about 10 to 11. And my senior thought that, he was serial number, he was in the court, and I was actually in Justice Chittatosh Mukherjee's court for some small matter. So my senior handed over the phone to me and said to Mr. Sirvai, I'll give you somebody who is the son of the author of the judgment in Bachchan Singh. So you better continue this conversation. Well, the conversation got over somewhere around 11:30. When my case was called out, Justice Chittatosh Mukherjee said, well, this junior doesn't have the courtesy of appearing. You know, judges in those days were very lax were very tough about passing over matters or keeping back matters, as we call it here. So my senior got up and said, well, please forgive my junior because he's in a conversation with Mr. Sirvai, which I had passed on to him. Mr. Nani Palkhiwala was in this court. He would never carry his own gown, and he would typically borrow a gown from one of the juniors. One of the greats of the bar who always forgot his gown in Bombay House, always took a gown from someone else, even if it was a young member of the bar, and always wore a gown, may not have been a senior's gown. That was the great tradition. I mean, look at the leveler that he was. Mr. V.R. Manohar, again, came from Nagpur and practiced here as the Advocate General. Even before that, we had Firoz Damania, the great and redoubtable labor lawyer. And we had a host of lawyers from the appellate side. It is said that when Motilal Setalwad would walk into the bar room on the appellate side, he would say that I have come to the chamber of experts because I want an answer to a question of civil law. Because the lawyers on the appellate side were absolutely, there was clarity of viewpoint, absolute clarity on the position on civil or criminal law, law of procedure. And there were so many of these lawyers on the appellate side who you'd just sit across them in a conference and understand the ability to unravel intricate questions of law in very simple terms. When I became a judge, I had to confront my own fears. You know, judgeship brings you back face to face with your own fears. As a lawyer, you can hide your fears by saying, I'm not going to accept this brief. As a judge, you don't have the luxury of accepting or not accepting the brief because you have to answer everything that is on your board every day. Now, I was not a commercial lawyer. I thought that, public law was everything that there was to the practice of law. But nature has a very unique way of confronting you with your worst fears. And I was confronted with my own worst fears when I sat on the commercial bench. On my first or second day in the court, when I was sitting on a division bench with Justice A.P. Shah, I was open-mouthed because honestly, I was a little overwhelmed by the experience of sitting as a judge. In the first row, there was a fairly, there was a friend of ours at the bar who was sitting in the first row, and he opened his mouth exactly in the same manner that I was opening my mouth. When I suddenly realized that he was imitating me. Now, I was opening my mouth because I was just overwhelmed by the experience of suddenly making this transition from the bar to the bench. But then I realized from that little gesture that it's always nice to keep your mouth shut when you're a judge. I try to do that sometimes. But I was also told by Justice B.N. Sri Krishna once that, judges tend to be talkative, particularly in the after lunch session, if only to ward off sleep after a heavy lunch. I learned from this court the great tradition of dictating judgments in court. I think this is one great tradition of our court, of not reserving judgments. So when I get a letter, and there's so many letters which come to the Chief Justice of India, there's almost nothing in the judicial system which is not brought to your attention. I'm told that, well, some judge has 300 judgments which are pending and which have not been delivered. And I say that, well, the only answer to this is to deliver judgments in court, which we learned as judges of the Bombay High Court, because that brings a sense of clarity. The importance of dictating judgments in the court, as we learned here, was that at a certain point, when a case is being argued, you are rotating the structure of the judgment in your mind. Now, whether or not you actually deliver judgment in a court, it may be a very complex case where you may not deliver judgment because it's going to be... There were times when judges were known to have delivered judgments for 7 days, for instance, the Lakshmi Cooperative Bank case. Judgment is delivered for 7 days on an end. I don't think judges today of the Bombay High Court had that luxury because your board would get clogged. But what happens really is by developing the art of dictating judgments in the court, you learn how to rotate the structure of the judgment in your mind. And I have carried this even when we are dealing with important cases in the Constitution bench. Several of my colleagues have asked me in the Supreme Court, how do you dictate immediately after arguments are over? And the answer to it is very simple, that when lawyers are arguing and you're in this parley with lawyers, you're constantly trying to develop a structure, not merely of the law, not merely of the facts, but how you're going to craft your judgment. And that is something which we learned from the High Court. My first opportunity to preside over a division bench, which came after almost 11 years of being a judge, was to preside over a tax bench. And when Justice Jayan Patel told me that I was going to preside over a tax bench, I said, but I haven't really done that much of tax work. So he said, that's exactly the reason why I've given you tax work. I want you to be challenged in whatever you're doing. So we learned to be challenged, but just as we learned as young judges, as fairly middle-level judges, as senior judges to be challenged, we had this great assistance of the bar. There were lawyers who would appear before you, and you knew that there would be not even one element of prevarication. You could actually take your notes on your notepad and dictate a judgment without consulting the relevant pages of the brief. So particularly for the young lawyers, I want to emphasize the importance of being ethical in the practice of law. In our effort to, tide over the competition, and the competition at the bar is becoming so intense today, there's a tendency to cut corners. Judges with the great burden of work may not be able to fathom every corner of a case, and maybe you'll get away with it by having perhaps hoodwinked the judge into not realizing that there was some other point in the case, especially if your lawyer on the other side is not vigilant enough. But the law has a tendency of catching up with you. And it is so very important, therefore, to be fair to the court. Because that is something in a reputation of a member of the bar which sticks. I know as a judge that there are some lawyers who I know will never be easy on the truth. And I do believe, therefore, that I can expedite the disposal of a particular case because what they tell you in court will be the absolute truth in the case. Whether they succeed or fail is subsidiary to the cause. As commercial lawyers, we got tremendous assistance from the members of the bar on the commercial side. This is the home of the commercial bar. Mumbai is the home of the commercial bar, and I think that is what has sustained the image of the court as one of the leading commercial courts in the country. Something that we have to keep up. But above all, I always ask myself, and I say this is a time of reflection, the tradition of sustaining juniors at the bar, that our court really continues to flourish. I said I'm not going to begin with a prepared text. I didn't have a prepared text. I wrote something out. It came straight from the heart. I began with, where do I begin? I'm not ending as yet. I will therefore just conclude by saying, where do I begin? There's a lot more to be said, and hopefully you will hear more of me, both formally and informally. Thank you very much for making this a memorable day in my life. Thank you.